FDA recently published draft guidance to fresh produce growers and others to help inform them of how they are currently interpreting the produce safety rule. It represented their current thinking of how the produce safety rule should be enforced and provides examples and clarification about some uncertainties in the rule. This is a draft guidance, and they're looking to industry to provide comments. Key to making informed comments is understanding what's in the draft guidance and how it differs from what has been published before. This video is the third in a series to attempt to shed light on those differences. This video will only cover Chapter 3. Chapter 3 of the draft guidance begins on page 39 and covers Subpart D, Health and Hygiene. Unhygienic practices of farm personnel can largely contribute to produce-related outbreaks. This chapter focuses on preventing ill or infected persons from contaminating covered produce, implementing hygienic practices to minimize the risk of contamination by personnel, and minimizing the risk of contamination by visitors. As mentioned in Chapter 2, it's important to remember that personnel can include full-time, part-time, contracted, and seasonal employees, as well as volunteers and paid or unpaid interns at your facility. The requirements discussed in this chapter apply to anyone that handles covered produce or food contact surfaces at any time. Section 1 discusses measures you can take to prevent ill or infected persons from contaminating covered produce. On page 40, they define an applicable health condition as a communicable illness that presents a public health risk in the context of normal work duties. Signs and symptoms of an applicable health condition, as stated on page 40 and 41, can include vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramps, sore throat with fever, jaundice, and open wounds. Personnel must be trained to recognize these symptoms as discussed in Chapter 2. They must also be instructed to notify their supervisor if there is a reasonable possibility that they have an applicable health condition. On page 42, the draft guidance provides ways to promote self-identification of applicable health conditions. Along with training personnel on how to identify symptoms of an applicable health condition, personnel should be aware of the potential to be an asymptomatic carrier. Asymptomatic carriers have a contagious illness that does not exhibit any symptoms, so they may not know they're infected. If personnel are exposed to individuals who may have an applicable health condition, they should pay extra attention to their hygienic practices. The bottom of page 42 emphasizes the importance of communication between supervisors and all other employees. Supervisors should be aware of their responsibilities regarding the health and hygiene requirements of the produce safety rule. This could include assessing personnel for applicable health conditions, reminding personnel to report any symptoms of concern they experience or observe, and knowing when to exclude or reassign affected workers. The produce safety rule requires you to exclude any persons from working in any operations that may result in contamination of covered produce or food contact surfaces until the person's health condition no longer presents a risk. Page 43 stresses that the requirement applies to any person who may have an applicable health condition. This could include a mechanic contracted to repair non-food contact equipment located near covered produce, or an unpaid intern who brings food packing materials into the packing area. If a worker has an applicable health condition, depending on the symptoms they present, there are several measures that can be taken. The worker may be temporarily excused from work, or they may be temporarily reassigned to a job that does not involve direct or indirect contact with covered produce, such as clerical activities. If the symptom involves a cut or a wound and is adequately covered with a bandage or glove, the worker may be allowed to continue their normal duties. Pages 44 and 45 of the draft guidance discuss what to do if someone with an applicable health condition contaminates covered produce. You must take appropriate measures to ensure the affected produce is not distributed unless its safety can be reasonably assured. You should consider isolating and ceasing activities in the areas of potential contamination, and either isolating and holding the contaminated produce until its safety can be evaluated, or completely disposing of the contaminated produce. The affected surfaces in the area should be either cleaned and sanitized or replaced. Applying hygienic practices is discussed on page 45. All farm workers should understand the importance of consistently following hygienic practices to prevent contamination, even if their job duties do not directly involve covered produce or food contact surfaces. The The bottom of page 46 reinforces that you must assign one or more supervisors to oversee your operations to ensure compliance with the requirements of the produce safety rule. The supervisors should ensure the other personnel are consistently following hygienic practices, and they should identify unhygienic practices that need to be addressed. On page 47, the draft guidance lists hygienic practices that are required by the produce safety rule. These include maintaining adequate personal cleanliness, avoiding contact with animals other than working animals, washing hands thoroughly, maintaining gloves in an intact and sanitary condition, removing or covering hand jewelry that cannot be adequately cleaned and sanitized, and refraining from eating, chewing gum, and using tobacco products in an area used for a covered activity. The rest of this section further explains each one of these requirements. To maintain adequate personal cleanliness, exposed skin, outerwear, clothing, and footwear should be free of filth and debris when beginning job duties involving covered produce or food contact surfaces. On page 48, the draft guidance provides strategies you can use to satisfy this requirement, such as instructing personnel to wear clean aprons while packaging covered produce. Personnel should be aware of their proximity to animals, and they must wash their hands as soon as practical after touching animals. An important thing to highlight on page 49 is that FDA does not expect you to remove animals from your farm. In order to minimize the risk of personnel transferring contamination from working animals to covered produce, the draft guidance suggests multiple different strategies. For example, if a worker has job duties involving direct contact with both working animals and covered produce, you could ensure that they complete those duties involving covered produce before any duties that involve working animals during a given day. When discussing thorough hand washing, the draft guidance states here that you must not use hand sanitizers as a substitute for soap and water, as grease has been shown to reduce sanitizers' effectiveness in eliminating microorganisms. When washing hands, personnel should make sure to scrub around and under the fingernails, as this is where the greatest concentration of microbes typically exists. Common or shared towels should not be used for drying hands. On page 50 and 51, the draft guidance lists the circumstances in which personnel are required to wash their hands. On page 52, the draft guidance explains that you are not required to use gloves, but if you choose to do so, they cannot have holes, tears, or cracks. FDA recommends a number of guidelines when using gloves that contact covered produce, including storing them separately from those used for other activities, having designated short-term and long-term storage areas, and periodically assessing the gloves to ensure replacement or cleaning when necessary. On page 54, when the draft guidance covers hand jewelry, it's important to highlight that rings with adornments or embellishments, bracelets, and watches are unlikely to be adequately cleaned and sanitized, and must either be covered using gloves or sleeve guards or removed. While personnel are prohibited from eating, chewing gum, and using tobacco products in an area used for covered activity, drinking beverages is allowed in designated areas away from covered produce and food contact surfaces. Here, the draft guidance suggests locating these areas near hand washing facilities in order to help facilitate hand washing after breaks for beverage drinking. Section 3 of the draft guidance, beginning on page 54, covers the measures you must take to prevent visitors from contaminating produce. On page 55, it states that visitors must be made aware of farm policies and procedures to protect against contamination of covered produce and food contact surfaces. You have the flexibility to determine how to communicate these policies, whether it's verbal, written, or graphic instructions, or a combination of all three. Here, the draft guidance provides 3 examples on how you can fulfill this requirement. When making comments on the guidance, keep several things in mind. Reference a section of the rule you have particular issues with. Be specific about the issue you're presenting. Avoid ranting. Offer alternatives to interpretation. Remember that the law is not changing or going away. This represents how the government interprets the law. The draft guidance covers all aspects of the produce safety rule except Section E, agricultural water. Public comment on this draft guidance is being accepted until April 22, 2019. Michigan State University Extension encourages looking into the guidance and commenting before the deadline.